Wafatnya Ratu Elizabeth Kedua membuat seluruh dunia bereaksi. Ungkapan duka, cita, dan bela, sungkawa pun disampaikan oleh berbagai pemimpin dunia. Ratu Elizabeth yang telah memerintah Inggris selama 70 tahun tidak hanya dianggap sebagai simbol kerajaan Inggris, tetapi juga pemersatu Inggris Raya dan negara-negara persemakmuran. Nah, lalu seperti apa masa depan Inggris sepeninggalan Ratu Elizabeth Kedua, dan juga bagaimana rakyat menerima Raja Charles III sebagai penerus tahta kerajaan? Insight akan membahasnya bersama saya, Desi Anwar.
Kamis 8 September 2022, Ratu Elizabeth Kedua dinyatakan meninggal dunia pada usia 96 tahun di Kastil Balmoral, Skotlandia. Sebelum mangkat, Ratu Elizabeth mendapat perawatan intensif dari tim dokter yang dipimpin oleh Profesor Sir Hugh Thomas, ahli gastrointestinal asal Inggris. Kondisi kesehatan Ratu Elizabeth terus menurun sejak tahun lalu. Hal ini membuat tim dokter harus meminta Ratu membatalkan sejumlah agenda untuk beristirahat. Ratu Elizabeth Kedua adalah ratu terlama yang memegang tahta kerajaan Inggris sepanjang sejarah, yaitu 70 tahun. Semasa hidupnya, pemerintahan Ratu Elizabeth Kedua mencakup 15 Perdana Menteri, mulai era Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, hingga Liz Truss. Selain Inggris, Ratu Elizabeth adalah ratu bagi 14 negara lain seperti Australia, Kanada, dan Selandia Baru. Selain itu, ia adalah kepala persemakmuran negara-negara bekas jajahan Inggris yang meliputi 54 negara. Dengan mangkatnya Ratu Elizabeth, Pangeran Charles yang berusia 73 tahun naik tahta sebagai raja. Charles pun menjadi pewaris tahta dengan penantian terlama dalam sejarah keluarga kerajaan Inggris.
Wafat di usia 96 tahun, Ratu Elizabeth Kedua memerintah Inggris dalam periode terlama dalam sejarah negara itu. Dan selama duduk di tahta kerajaan, sang ratu telah menyetujui lebih dari 4.000 undang-undang parlemen. Legasi ini tentu saja membawa Inggris menjadi negara besar seperti sekarang. Nah, untuk membahasnya lebih dalam lagi, di studio sudah hadir bersama saya Profesor Peter Carey, sejarawan Inggris dan sekaligus Indonesianis. Halo Pak Peter, apa kabar?
Baik-baik saja.
Senang sekali berjumpa.
Ya.
Sehat kan?
Sehat walafiat, alhamdulillah.
Penting ya sehat. Turut berduka cita atas wafatnya Ratu Elizabeth Kedua yang telah membuat seluruh kerajaan Inggris itu berhenti selama 11 hari. For 11 days there was a national mourning, and it's not just in the United Kingdom, obviously, but even us here in Indonesia. We also participated in the whole ceremony. It says that over 4 billion people are estimated to have watched the state funeral, and basically that we've seen people in England queuing up to 25 hours just to pay their respect to the late Queen. Now, Peter, from as a historian, put your own perspective and a historical perspective. So what has the last, the 11 days or the 10 days of mourning, what were we seeing exactly? And what is the significance of it all?
Well, obviously, in a formal way, we were seeing a process of national mourning for the demise of a ruler, of a monarch. The last time, obviously, a state funeral happened was in '65, January, for Winston Churchill. And the last time the funeral of a monarch took place was exactly 70 years ago for George VI, who was the Queen's father. And it followed pretty much the same pattern, obviously, but it was under the shadow of the Second World War. Rationing was still going on. You had black and white television. You didn't have color television. It was obviously much, in terms of its footprint as an event, a much smaller scale, whereas this has been inglorious Technicolor. It's been very much in the public eye, and as you said in your introduction, maybe as many as 4 billion people around the world, which is sort of half the world's population, were at least aware of this and saw some of it on television. So it's been a big, media production, and also lots and lots of world leaders have come. The Emperor of Japan and Jair Bolsonaro and Macron, and a large number have come. Many have come, obviously, out of respect for the Queen, but many have also come because this is actually a very public moment, and to be seen in the right place earns some brownie points politically. So, it's...
and everybody wanted to be there. And,
everybody wanted to be there. Even Vladimir Putin was miffed because he didn't get an invitation.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't get an invitation either. I'm quite miffed. But Peter, you said this is something that is actually, it's an old thing. It's a traditional thing. A state funeral has always been like that, has it? I mean, what has changed and what has remained the same? Obviously, in terms of the technology and how many people are viewing around the world, because now we have television that is, it's broadcast live and everything, and also people can travel and so on and so forth. But was it a genuinely were people really sad, and the outpouring of grief, the constant non-stop media coverage? I mean, is this something that you actually expected as a historian looking past at what's been happening in the UK in the last 70 years of her reign? Is this something you expected?
Yeah, I mean, it's the end of an era. I mean, 70 years is a very long time. I mean, I saw the coronation as a 5-year-old, the colonial child. We came back from Burma to see it. I saw it through the legs of adults on the Mall. And it was a big deal. And I think in terms of her passing, for most people, the Queen has been a fixed element in the firmament of their lives. And she's grown into someone who has a place in people's lives and in their hearts, in a way. She was a supreme diplomat. She was obviously had a very caring side. I mean, I know
she was
this.
well liked, right?
And she was very well liked. Yeah,
and respected and admired.
And obviously, she lived a life which was not for ordinary mortals, as it were, but she was very. She had a common touch, and I can relate maybe 2 things which you probably already know. One was that she became very good friends with your first ambassador, Dr. Subandrio, who then became head of intelligence and foreign minister for the Lama, for Sukarno, after the period of guided democracy. And he, Kana Imbas, I mean, he was the person who, was affected deeply by 65, and he was brought before Mapmelub, and there was a question that he might be executed. And the Queen actually intervened, or she was said to have intervened, with the government of Indonesia to spare his life. I mean, he was ultimately freed in the mid-90s, so he spent a very long time in prison. But she was apparently one of the key voices which was instrumental in saving his life, because she'd become a friend and someone who respected him and liked him. The other was when the surgeon from Syria, David Nott, came and had lunch with the Queen. I don't know whether it was totally private lunch, but he was deeply traumatized by what he had seen in Aleppo. And the Queen wanted to meet him to sort of thank him and to share some of his experiences. And during the lunch, he became all the trauma of what he'd witnessed on the surgical wards and in the operations which he conducted in Aleppo came back, and he became almost catatonic. And the Queen immediately recognized his state and called in her corgis to assemble under the table, and the Queen and David Nott got down and fed the corgis under the table. And that was a way to cairkan, to sort of actually...
Very much human touch.
Yeah, I mean, naluri yang tajam. I don't know how you say that in English, but a very sensitive
It's
and
very compassionate.
I mean, there was a side to her which was, and she was also a supreme diplomat. I mean, you can see this with apartheid. You know, I mean, you have Mrs. Thatcher in power, and she was all for supporting the apartheid regime of Dr. Vorster and Verwoerd and whoever else was in power in Pretoria. And the Queen was the head of the Commonwealth, and basically the tide had turned, even in the former white dominions of Australia and Canada and New Zealand, that they did not want to play ball any longer with Pretoria under an apartheid regime, because it was totally out of the ballpark in terms of where the world had moved on. And she maneuvered very skillfully to put Mrs. Thatcher in a majority or minority of one, and was able to...
No, which is incredible if you think about it. That, the fact that she wasn't, I mean, the Queen or the monarch is not supposed to have sort of meddled in things that smells of, politics. And that she managed to do that.
But here was someone who actually played her cards very cannily and very skillfully. She was almost very Javanese in that respect. I mean, a very sort of sangat ulung, very lincah in the way she conducted herself. And she was schooled with a private tutor in Bagehot's constitution, so she knew, the dignified part of the constitution, what was expected, and she was not going to play party politics. But in this case, it was the future of the Commonwealth, and it was the future of her position as head of the Commonwealth, which was at stake. And for her, that overrode the views and opinions of the Prime Minister of the day. But she conducted herself with great skill.
Peter, we'll take a little break. We still have a long way to go in this conversation, but very, very interesting. And I also would like to have your own, perspective, how you felt when she died, and then watching it, and what did you feel was the really big loss when it came to losing Queen Elizabeth II after a 70-year of reign, after her Platinum Jubilee quite recently. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali, tetaplah bersama kami. Masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Saya ditemani Profesor Peter Carey, sejarawan Inggris sekaligus orang Indonesianis, dan sudah cukup lama tinggal di Indonesia sekarang ya, Pak Peter. Sudah berapa lama?
15 tahun.
Wah, sudah orang Indonesia sejati kalau begitu. Peter, well, thank you very much, by the way, for the insights, especially with the Indonesian connection with Subandrio. But you yourself, you had a personal connection, obviously. You were given an MBE, member of the British Empire. So for yourself, and also, for British people like you, what did you feel the real loss when the Queen, died, and then you mentioned that it's the end of an era. What's the country actually mourning for? Obviously, rather than, on top of losing somebody that they've known for the last 70 years, or even 96 years for those people who've lived long enough. So what was actually kind of the thoughts that came into most people's mind when they saw her lying in state?
Well, I mean, it's very obviously the end of an era.
What sort of an era are we talking about?
Well, Britain has gone through a parabola. I mean, I was born in Burma in '48, and I remember when Everest was conquered by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing, and in May of 1953 as a present for the Queen's coronation. And at that time, Britain was still an imperial power. And obviously the Queen's, top of the agenda for the Queen was extricating Britain from the empire in a halus and skillful way. I mean, she was not at the sharp end. She never went to any flag-lowering ceremony, but her presence, her skill, presence of mind, and her diplomacy, and her natural tact and knowledge of how she should act probably smooth the sharper edges of that prima facie messy withdrawal from empire. And the fact that the Commonwealth became such a successful organization was, I think, in large measure due to her presence. I mean, she grew into that role. I mean, she made her vow as a young 21-year-old in South Africa.
To serve the country.
Yeah, so she was going long or short. She would dedicate it to the
long,
country.
as it turned out.
And she very long, and right up to the very last moment. I mean, this is a, boucler le boucle. It's the end of a. It's
She
a
was
very.
still working.
She's
right at the
working
very
to the
end,
sixth. I mean, she said goodbye to Boris Johnson. She said,
new
welcome
Prime
to the
Minister.
new Prime Minister. And then 2 days later, she was dead. I mean, this is a life which is lived to the full. Tidak merepotkan orang waktu meninggal. I mean, she just, it was a very, you know, it was a bit like the eclipse of a planet.
And she gave that last hurrah with the Platinum Jubilee.
That's right.
Everybody
Yeah.
had, you know, party and,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
thinking of it.
Yeah.
But what has England or the United Kingdom, what has actually lost in her passing? What has actually ended in terms of, okay, now we have to open, you know, you're a historian, open a new chapter or a new volume in the history book. What are we saying goodbye to?
Well, we're
Peter
saying goodbye to someone who actually provided continuity, stability, and wisdom at a time when Britain was going through some very turbulent moments. I mean, you know, we're at a post-Brexit, you know. Anybody in their right mind, you've got a market of 600 million people on your doorstep, would think many times before taking such a step. And yet Britain has taken that. And the impact on the Union, I mean, Britain is 3 kingdoms and a principality. The 3 kingdoms are England, Scotland and Ireland. And the principality is Wales. When that vote took place for Brexit, you know, 62% of Scottish voters voted to remain in the EU, and 57% of Northern Ireland voters voted to remain in the EU. Wales, it was lower, but I mean, certainly the sort of component parts of the UK, there must be a big question mark about how long the UK can survive in its present form, and that the presence of the Queen, the presence of her longevity and her, I mean, the sort of momentum which she built up, the sort of pundi of treasures, you know, which are in these earthen vessels, was immense. I mean, she had an immense charisma, and when Scots, I mean, the fact she died in Balmoral, you know, I mean, she died in her favourite place, in Balmoral, in Aberdeenshire, and she had this sort of royal progress, you know, taken by car from Balmoral to Edinburgh, and then all the obsequies in Edinburgh itself, and then at last brought down to London. I mean, she was very evidently not just a queen for England, she was a queen for all the component parts.
And she was very instrumental in creating that peace in Northern Ireland when she did that visit back in, you know,
in 2011 she made a very important visit to Ireland, which was the first time since George V, exactly 100 years previously, in 1911, had made a visit, and he was then King Emperor, you know, and it was Britain's first colony. And after that, there was the Easter Uprising, there was the War of Independence, there was the whole economic war with Britain, there was Eamon de Valera and the, you know, the sort of perselisian antara dua adik dan kakak, and she was able to actually, by her presence, symbolically and actually not just metaphorically, but also dengan bermakna, bring a certain healing. She went to Croke Park. She bowed her head in front of the equivalent of the cenotaph for those who had died in the War of Independence.
That really touched.
And she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, who was one of the IRA commanders in Derry. You know, she just by looking at her dress, I mean, she dressed in
In the colours,
Republican
yeah.
green. You know, it wasn't too green, but it was green nonetheless. Yeah.
So these symbols are extremely important.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you look at the pageantry, I mean, it's all about symbols,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And like you said, she's been around for 70 years. So it's basically, she's been sort of like the glue
Yeah,
that
exactly.
keeps everything together, sort of like the magnet that now that she's gone,
Yeah.
King Charles III, you know, long live the king, and
Yeah.
you know the monarchy will live on because England is in the
Sure.
UK is, you know, constitutional monarchy is your
Yeah.
Pancasila,
Sure.
so to speak. What's going to happen? Will this glue kind of, you know, at some point dry up, or will it still have
yeah.
that?
I mean, obviously, Britain has 1,200 years of monarchical rule.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's quite
And long and short, and you know.
long-lived. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, everybody raised their eyebrows and said, well, who will follow her? And in fact, Edward VII was he was a modernizing monarch, and he did things, everybody thought he was just a roue and someone who spent his time at the gambling tables at Monte Carlo and, you know, went across to Paris and etc. and Biarritz. But in fact, he grew into his role.
He grew into his role.
Yeah. So the question is whether Charles, despite
Okay.
the,
Let's hold that thought.
Yeah.
Will Charles III be able to hold a candle to his mother, and will people see in sosok seorang Charles the kind of the same, you know, gravitas and also credibility figure that people could admire like they did Elizabeth II. Tetaplah bersama kami, Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar, mengenang Ratu Elizabeth Kedua yang baru saja wafat. Saya ditemani oleh Profesor Peter Carey, sejarawan Inggris, dan juga seorang Indonesianis yang 15 tahun sudah tinggal di Indonesia. Peter, we were talking about the end of an era, but the monarchy lives on.
Yes.
Will the monarchy lives on forever as it's been, you mentioned, for the last 1,200
200 years.
200
To
years.
the Anglo-Saxons, yeah.
Will King Charles III have the same kind of, you know, the commanding presence that Queen Elizabeth had? I mean, crystal ball as a historian looking forward, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think, I mean, he's got assets. I mean, he's certainly campaigned for the environment and for issues to do, and he was ahead of the curve for that. You know, it went back to
very early,
talking to plants in the 1970s. So it's not something he's just discovered. It's something which is really close to his heart. And he's been a good ambassador for Britain and for this cause. I mean, he's spoken blak-blakan, he speaks his mind on that.
But not as well liked as a late queen.
No,
I mean, he was
no.
like, if I look at the survey, Queen Elizabeth was #1, and then somewhere #7
Sure.
was Charles III, well below even, you know, Kate and William.
Yeah. I mean, to be a monarch is a multifaceted task. You have to be
You have to be born into it to
a
begin
man
with.
for all seasons, a woman for all seasons. The fact she was a woman was very important. He's a man, not a woman. And she was able to get away with things which she might not have done if she was a male monarch. But what is interesting is that, as a monarch, you should be able to rule, be dignified, to have the sense of the honor and prestige and orza of the office, but at the same time not lose the common touch. At the very end, for the Jubilee, the Queen made that skit with Paddington Bear, and she was just on cue and everything,
Yes,
So basically, she sort of captured people's hearts, and she was able to do that. If you look back here in Indonesia, I mean, you had someone who was equally important, albeit for a much shorter time, namely the Sultan of Jogja, Hamengkubuwono IX, who gave his court city, he gave his palace, who spent a lot of his own money on supporting the Republic, and was genuinely a Republican Sultan. The Republic owes a lot to him.
But the emotional aspect is very important in this whole thing, right? I mean, all the pageantry is actually there to sort of move you into, you know, no more politics, no more that, but everybody sort of glued and share this, whether it's value, whether it's awe, and suddenly it's like, you know, starts thinking about your identity, starts questioning about, you know, what's going to happen and so on and so forth. But tell us a little bit, and this has to do with, you know, the British, the Constitution. I mean, because we know that at least, how many percent? 30% of people, if they're surveyed, they said they would rather have an elected head of state, or as well as, you know, head of government. So, is this something that in England, is it something foreseeable that at some point people are going to say, how relevant is the monarchy? How relevant is the royal family? What's your sense? Will they still be relevant?
Well, it could be. I mean, you know, obviously royal families bite the dust. I mean, if you look at the Bourbon monarchs of France, they did not move with the times. You know, on the first day of the revolution, the king was out hunting, and he put in his diary, rien, nothing. His commander didn't have time to change his clothes. And the king asked him, Monsieur, c'est une révolte, is it a revolt? And he said, non, sire, c'est une révolution. You know, so he's completely out of touch. I mean, I brought up the figure of the ninth Sultan because obviously when I was in Jogja, a story which did the rounds was that he was in his jeep one day and he was going through one of the streets, and some old lady who was going to the Bringaja market flagged him down and asked him to load a bag of rice onto the jeep. And he didn't get down and said, well, how dare you? He loaded the bag of rice onto his Willis jeep and he delivered it to Bringaja, and he diturunkan, and everybody said, you got the Sultan, you know, helping you out. And, you know, old Bakul, Baku Yang Bakul was beside herself with mortification. But here is someone who doesn't lose his connection, common touch. And when he was, he got a ticket for going down a one-way street in Semarang, and he praised the police officer. He actually brought the police officer to Jogja to have a role there because he said, you've done your job. And I think Charles is going to be judged by how he conducts himself. You know, the one person in the royal family, I think, who sangat makan garam is Duke of Edinburgh, because he lost, he was smuggled out in orange box, and had to rebuild his life, etc., etc. And the early signs of the Charles III losing his rag over a leaking pen at Hillsborough Castle when he was, you know, signing a document, that sort of incident indicates this, someone who actually takes himself rather seriously, is not able to sort of emotionally
connect with his people,
sort of scale himself down, and also laugh at himself. Yeah.
But also the Charles's namesake, Charles I, lost his head, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So there was a history of England not having a monarch, that it was more or less a republic.
I mean, it had, obviously the Parliament won the Civil War. Charles I was very rigid. He was not prepared, you know, he said between a monarch and a subject, you know, there is a clear rift, and a great gulf is fixed, yeah? So he had an idea of absolute monarchy and a style of monarchy which was much more continental than being in accord with a parliamentary relationship. And that did for him, yeah? So if you are bersikuku kras, yeah, you're not going to be langgeng. You're not going to be long-lived. Yeah?
Exactly. I mean, we talk about revolution in France. England
Yeah.
did the revolution way long
Sure.
before
Yeah.
the French Revolution. But, you know, from your historical perspectives, the monarchy, the royal family, is it very much part of parcel of, you know, what the United, at least for England, you know, United Kingdom is talking about, you know, in the years ahead?
Yeah.
Or is this something that would evolve into something a little bit different?
It
Like, for
permeates
example,
every pore of national life, and you can see that from the recent 11 days. Yeah, so it's not something which sits at the top and sort of is there in a bubble. So it's an important institution, but even important institutions. I mean, think of the Ancien Regime in France, where the king permeated every single nook and cranny of the Ancien Regime in terms of status and honor. It can still hit the buffers. Yeah. And Britain is a united kingdom. It's not a unitary kingdom. It's not an NKR.
NKRI.
You know, it's not a unitary monarchy. It's a monarchy which has to deal with component parts. And it requires, I mean, if I was an advisor to Prince Charles, I would, King Charles now, King Charles III, I would bring to the fore the example of the Netherlands, and I'd bring to the fore the example of the papacy. With the papacy, you had Benedict XIV standing down and saying, okay, my time has come. Maybe there was a scandal in the Curia with the Vatican Bank or whatever, but he stood aside, and a very radically different pope, an Argentinian, who had a very radically different background, came to the fore. He was not everyone's cup of tea in terms of the Catholic Church, but he was someone who was brought a new wind. And if you look at Queen Beatrix, she stood down in 2012 to allow her son, the first male monarch for the House of Orange since almost 120 years, Willem Alexander, to come to the throne. So either he, like Edward VII, he dies not too long after taking the throne, or he
gives it to his son.
Or he gives it to his son, who is obviously Menjiwai. You know, he representative, the millennial, Z generation.
Dan anaknya
and he's
Putri
much
Diana.
more accessible. He's much more user-friendly than someone who looks like a sort of a landowner who's just been disturbed from his hunt.
You know, hopefully you can be his advisor. We'll have another little break. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Tetaplah bersama kami. Bersama Insight with Desi Anwar, ada Profesor Peter Carey, sejarawan Inggris sekaligus Indonesianis di studio bersama saya, dan kita berbicara mengenai apa yang akan terjadi khususnya di Inggris ketika Ratu Elizabeth Kedua meninggal dunia, setelah 70 tahun bertahta. Peter, I mean, you know, people go to England, of course, the first thing they want to do is they want to take photos, you know, front of Buckingham Palace, they buy the souvenirs. But the royal family, the monarchy, all the pageantry, all these symbolisms, the ancient traditions. I mean, it sells. I mean, it's why we're all glued to the television watching this, because for us, it's something that reminds us of and links us to a history. But at the same time, you know, going forward, you mentioned that, you know, as long as the royal family maintains its relevancy and it still has a connection with the people. What about the United Kingdom itself? You know, Scotland, we've seen that it had a referendum. Tipis-tipis ya, beda tipis. Northern Ireland, of course, you know, I'm sure they would like to see the whole of Ireland united. What's the future for the next?
There are large challenges ahead. I mean, obviously, first off the rank as the taxi is Northern Ireland because of Brexit. You know, you've got an agreement with Brussels not to have a hard border in the 82, 62 miles, which the 4 counties of the north are divided with the 24 counties, or the 6 counties of the north with the 24 counties of the south, the Republic. But the reality is, obviously, that in the north, Catholic families are having more children than Protestant families, and there's a demographic shift. And that demographic shift has been translated into political power for Sinn Féin, who are actually represented on both sides of the border.
And they're Republicans, obviously.
In the Dáil, and they're representative in Hillsborough, in the Northern Ireland Parliament. Yeah, and the dream is for fields bloom again. You know, Ulster, Munster, Connaught, and the 4 provinces of Ireland. Yeah,
to be together again. Yeah.
Be together again, and Leinster. Yeah, and that was the goal of the Irish Revolution, the Independence War. There was, at the end, there was an agreement, maybe like the sort of agreement which will be forced on Ukraine, to sort of agree that there is a temporary halt to hostilities, and that the North goes on under its own aegis. And at that time, obviously, all the shots were called in a very gerrymandered constitution by the Protestant power holders. But that is not the case now. And I think that if Liz Truss tears up, the new Prime Minister tears up the agreement with Brussels and decides that the sort of fudge at the moment, which is that there are inspections going on in the Irish Sea, and indeed the sort of Isle of Man is a sort of transit point, and that stops, and that there's a hard border, not only is Britain going to be athwart Brussels, but it's also going to be athwart the United States, where Joe Biden is very much a dyed-in-the-wool Irish and nationalist, and someone like Nancy Pelosi has said, true strong, yeah. It's a bit like what Holland encountered after the second Dutch police action. You know, if you go on with this, please go on. If you don't come back to the negotiating table, that's your choice. But you can forget martial aid for fiscal 50-51. And obviously, with that sort of financial suasion, the Dutch had to come back to the negotiating table and had to recognize the Republic, admittedly as a United States of Indonesia, briefly. The same type of suasion is going to come on London at a time when inflation is rocketing and that it doesn't have great reserves. It's not a sterling
economic
area.
Crisis.
Economic, yeah. So Ireland is the first taxi off the rank, and that's got to be handled with extreme care, and there's got to be a give and take. Yeah. And if we've changed both sort of key figures within the British Constitution within weeks of each other. Well, within days of each other.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean,
you know,
we have
in
a
2 days.
Prime Minister who...
You've got a new Prime Minister on the 6th, and you've got a new monarch on the night of the 8th, 9th. So, you know, this is a tectonic shift.
Yeah, but do you think, I mean, are you optimistic? I mean, because, you know, we've seen, say, if Scotland has another referendum, say, 5 years from now, and King Charles hasn't, you know, shown himself to be sort of quite, not like his mother. What would the United Kingdom would look like without, you know, Scotland and the Northern Ireland saying, no, we want to be part of Europe.
We want to be part of Europe, and we also
want to be
perhaps the Catholic population would like to be part of the Republic.
Exactly. We don't want to have a monarchy, and that would just leave what, England and Wales?
It would leave England and Wales, yeah, and obviously England has been that. I mean, prior to the Union of the Crowns in 1601 with James I and VI, which was a personal union, and then a political union in 1707, in which Britain had a major card to offer, which was to say to the Scots business interests, you can actually have a slice of the pie in terms of both power, someone like Viscount Melville, who became Henry Dundas, who became the Commissioner for India, and as well as becoming Commissioner for Scotland, lots and lots of goodies were offered to the Scots because Britain was an imperial power. Those goodies don't exist anymore in the same form. And in fact, much closer to hand are the blandishments of being a part of the European Union.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah?
Because they were all for, remaining. They were
Sure.
part of the remaining group, right?
And senjata makan tuan. I mean, the Javanese have a saying, "Ojo dume," yeah? Don't be arrogant. Don't be proud. Don't be, I mean, I think I have lived in Indonesia now, so I see the world through Indonesian eyes. I don't see it necessarily through British eyes. But to go down the road of Brexit is, for me, comes out of arrogance.
Yeah. Tapi nasi sudah menjadi bubur.
Yeah.
It's happened, and it wasn't supposed to happen, but it happened, and it's a lot of people think it's a mistake, but for those who wanted England, who wanted to have Brexit, this is something that they wanted.
Yeah,
So,
it's sort of l'Angleterre profonde.
Yeah.
It's deep county.
the mentality.
It's the county mentality.
So
of
Britain,
the,
Great
yeah.
Britain, you have no, the great is gone, basically. I mean, let's open up the, perspective a little bit more. The Commonwealth, that's one thing that Queen Elizabeth is very much part of, proud of, and also the Commonwealth countries are very much attached to Queen Elizabeth because of her personality and her steadfastness, as opposed to belonging, a part of the Commonwealth with Great Britain. What's going to happen? We saw Kate and William's visit to...
Yeah, I mean, there are 15 countries, 14 if you leave out the UK, which has Charles III as the kingpin, the sort of monarch, as it were, and you have governor-generals or Queen's representatives. But I think, I mean, you can judge by the reaction of the Queen's death in India and South Africa. Yeah? India and South Africa obviously had a very long and actually quite troubled relationship, a colonial relationship. And it was significant that neither Modi nor Cyril Ramaphosa came to, I mean, obviously the president and the equivalent in South Africa came.
But not...
the
Prime
sort
Minister,
of politically
the important ones.
The important ones. And you've got Barbados, which came out and became a republic only 18 months ago. It now has a president.
And Jamaica is now
and Jamaica is already, you had actually quite a troubled tour of Kate and William to the Caribbean. And they had to move quickly to be able to, to understand that this was not 1954 when the Queen was visiting Australia, or 1956 when she visited Jamaica for the first time. It's now, the third decade of the 21st century, and out of those 14 countries, quite a few will, I think, become republics. And it could be that you got a Prime Minister, Tony Albanese, in Australia, who is a Republican.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you've got a great friend of the late Queen in
Canada,
Trudeau,
in
Canada, but there is still a large arus in Canada towards actually becoming berdikari and becoming their own masters in their own house.
Okay, so it is the end of an era with the death of Queen Elizabeth II. It's reminded us that the world is now very much a different place than when she came to the throne back in 1952. We'll take another break. We still have one segment. And what does it mean for the rest of us in the world, and also for the future of the United Kingdom itself? Jangan kemana-mana dulu. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Kembali bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Kita segmen terakhir perbincangan dengan Profesor Peter Carey, Sejarawan Inggris. Dan topik kita adalah bagaimana kira-kira Inggris nanti ya di tengah geopolitik yang sangat berubah. Seperti kita lihat sekarang ada perang di Ukraine, kita sekarang post-COVID di mana ada berbagai macam masalah, krisis ekonomi, krisis pangan, krisis akibat perubahan iklim yang mengancam ya keberadaan kita semua di planet ini. Peter, Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II's namesake, that was another Elizabethan era. She gave that sort of the greatness to England during her reign. This is like the beginning of discovering the new world. You know, Francis Drake and all, you know, and conquering left, right, and center. And when we had like hundreds and hundreds of years of, you know, rule Britannia ruled the waves, creating empires around the world. For goodness sake, the lingua franca of the planet Earth is English. And then when she came to power in 1952, England was, you know, it was emerging from an empire that basically has lasted for hundreds of years. Now what? With the world like this, the world of polarization, the world of, even in England itself, you know, the Brexiteers, the anti-Europeans, the, you know, extreme ideologies. Where does that leave England?
Yeah, it's a little bit
how
like...
relevant
it's lost an empire but hasn't found a role, which was the Dean Acheson's view in 1940s, yeah, or General Marshall with the Marshall Aid Plan to rebuild Europe, yeah. The idea still lingers in the minds of many unreconstructed, you know, county-based Tory voters that Britain is still a global power, yeah. And in a way, culturally, the fact that we're having this conversation in English and not in Indonesian or not in French, I mean, if
or
this
in German,
was, or in German, yeah.
Queen's family,
yeah,
you mentioned
yeah,
it was a German origin.
But the reality is that Britain has prospered and been able to actually forge its way in the world by having actually a very close and mutually supportive relationship with Europe. Yeah, if you look at Elizabeth I, I mean, she was involved in an alliance with the 7 provinces, with Holland. Yeah, 100 years after Elizabeth, we had a Dutch king. The Dutch brought their expertise in banking. They had a central bank long before the Bank of England was founded, in the Bank of Amsterdam in 1645. When Louis XIV threw out the Huguenots, we received 40,000 Huguenots in the British Isles. 10,000 went to Ireland and 30,000 made their home in England, and they brought all sorts of skills, textile skills, skills in the book trade and in drama and in military expertise. We received in the interwar years a huge wave of continental Jews who came. Einstein was for a brief period in Britain. I mean, my colleague in Trinity, Hans Krebs, who described the Krebs cycle, he was a refugee from Europe, and Britain has been seen as bersahabat, and remember, you know, the monarchy actually started out as a German monarchy. After the Peace of Utrecht and with the death of Queen Anne, we had the Elector of Hanover who came over. He was a distant cousin, but he was the most, because Queen Anne had no male descendants, he was the most suitable as a Protestant monarch. And for the first 2 reigns, George I and George II, the Istana only spoke German. I mean, he spoke German. He had German advisors. This was the reality. Yeah. During the rise of Germany as a great power, we relied hugely on our alliance with France. We fought alongside France. We provided Soaka in 1940 to General de Gaulle. We fought also in the 1914-18 war with Russia. We had very close links with Russia. We had close links via the royal family. So the idea that Britain is somehow exceptional, doesn't have European, very deep European links. People who graduate in law in Scotland wouldn't actually practice and get their bar exams. They would go to Leiden because there's Roman law in Scotland and there's Roman law on the continent of Europe. So Britain, the Scottish Enlightenment,
Yep.
there wasn't an English Enlightenment, there was a Scottish Enlightenment because of the links between Europe and Scots economists and
So
philosophers
Brexit
and
basically
historians.
is a mistake in your eyes.
Well, it's spitting in the face of history. It's basically, you know, saying, well,
So-
okay, we have this destiny as a world power, but that's
also
the
nonsense
past,
because
yeah, we need to move on, and really the two heads of government, both the executive and the dignified part of that, has to recognise that actually you're skating on very, very thin ice. If you don't play the Irish card, not only do you have Ireland spinning out of control, but you also have the American Congress voting
Yeah.
to actually play some pretty hard ball with you financially.
But is there a way of reversing Brexit?
There could be a way of reversing
But is this
Brexit, or
possible?
there
Is
could
it
be a
going to
way
happen?
of skillfully doing what Norway did. Norway, a tiny country with only about 6 million people, but it had huge hydrocarbon reserves in the North Sea, and it made its own petroleum fund. A bit like Brunei, when Brunei decided not to join ASEAN in the early 1960s, when this huge offshore fields were discovered off Brunei Darussalam. It could. I mean, I think
But it's not likely,
Britain
right?
has to take the road to Canossa, has to eat humble pie, has to
Well, they have to do another referendum, and that's, I'm
Yep.
sure, is going to be like, you know, it's not that easy. But so it's a question of identity now. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, suddenly, you know, Britain, you know, starts to look at, you know, herself in the mirror and said, well, who am I,
Sure.
really? And what about for the rest of the world? I mean, how relevant is, say, if Northern Ireland goes at some point and Scotland says, you know, we want to be part of Europe, and you still kekeh dengan sendirian, pulau, a little island. Even now, how relevant is England on the world stage?
Well, I mean, Britain has considerable R&D, research and development. We saw that with
the COVID thing,
the
you
COVID,
know.
and the fact that Britain produced its own
AstraZeneca,
which was produced and developed in the labs in Oxford. So
and there's
the
an
clerks of
Indonesian actually
Oxenford,
also helping.
and also with Ukraine. I mean, it was a very staunch supporter and actually went accelerated ahead of what Europe did with Ukraine. So there are some benefits for being a berdikari. Yeah.
Okay.
And Britain has great educational institutions. I mean, Oxford tops the bill, and Cambridge and Imperial College and Brunel, and there are all sorts of and the Victorian Albert and the British Library and the City of London.
The British
you
Museum,
know,
and although they
I
start asking for their stuff back now, you know, the ex-colonies.
But, you know, I mean, Britain's got to realise that it's now a bit like Elizabeth I's Britain, and the fact that it has to pull itself up by its bootstraps. I mean, someone like Sir Francis Drake goes all the way to the Moluccas to discover a trade route and to make James I sent ambassadors to Bantam.
Are we capable? I mean, is England capable of that?
It's got to learn to be capable. I mean, I'm the child of a colonial family. Both my parents are petualang, are adventurers. My father went out at 21, sailed down the Mersey to make a life in Burma, to open a branch of his import-export company, Fairweather Richards, and to be a success.
I know, but the world's changed now. I mean,
and my mother was born in Shanghai.
Yeah, absolutely. But now, you know, all countries, it's all for nationalism, self-determination, and you know, all sorts of things like that. Peter, our time is okay. Your wish for now that we've, you know, buried Queen Elizabeth II, what sort of the United Kingdom? But like, you know, phoenix rising from the ashes, what will it look like, and what will its role in the world?
It needs to play its strongest suit in terms of the card of education, culture, the fact that English is a world language. As a global power, it's no longer an imperial power. it's no longer financially that critical in terms of the balance of power in the world, but it can actually help. We are all part of one planet. Yeah, here we are. We're sitting here talking. Every second that goes by, this planet is weaving through the universe at 12 miles a second. We've traveled hundreds of thousands of miles in the time we've just been sitting here. Yeah, my hope is that Britain, you know, like Karl Rahner said, you know, the future of humanity is mystical or it will be nothing. Yeah, we need to actually step up to the plate as human beings and realize that our destiny, we have a cosmic destiny and we have a cosmic role to play here on this planet Earth. And I hope that this eye of the needle we're going through in terms of right-wing nationalisms and extremism of religions and kepichikan, we have to actually get beyond that. Otherwise, you know, he said, there's that future, which is a cosmic and spiritual, or there is nothing. Yeah, we, you know, push comes to shove, we're right against. It's 5 minutes to midnight. Yeah, we've got to come up with some very, very manjur initiatives to be able to actually chart a course to sustainability and to be able to live bersahabat on this planet. And I think Britain has something to offer.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your optimism and to end this conversation on a high note. Because if we don't, you know, if we're not optimistic, if we think that everything is just going to fall apart, then what else is there?
That's why Indonesia has so much to offer the world.
And that's why you're here, Peter.
Spiritually, pundi-pundi, which is not without
and you're happy. You prefer living in Indonesia
This
than in
is,
England?
saya punya panggilan waktu saya masih muda sekali, 21 tahun di Olin Library, saya punya hubungan batin dengan gambar di Ponorogo, di Kesenian Indonesia of Tahraf. And this is my calling. This is why I'm here, to actually make Indonesians proud of their heritage. And I couldn't do that if I was in Oxford.
Thank you so much, Peter. And we are proud having you. Kita juga ikut bangga. Terima kasih banyak Pak Peter atas insight-nya, luar biasa. Dan demikian Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini. Anda juga dapat menyaksikan tayangan ini di cnnindonesia.com dan di YouTube CNN Indonesia Insight with Desi Anwar. Jangan lupa, masih ada COVID di antara kita. Jaga jarak, rajin cuci tangan, gunakan masker, dan hindari kerumunan. Sampai jumpa, stay safe. Bye-bye.